Today on the Axe Files, we're going back all the way to the 80s to look at an axed manga almost 40 years old, and one of the first serializations of Hirohiko Araki, the creator of JoJo. Full name, Baoh Raihosha or Baoh the Visitor. Start date, October 22nd, 1984. End date, February 25th, 1985. Total chapters 17, compiled into 2 volumes. Sometimes this is listed as 9 or 10 chapters since it had a weirdly compiled release by Viz Media in the 90s. Hirohiko Araki doesn't really need an introduction. He's one of the most famous mangaka to ever live, as well as one of the most successful and hardworking. But he had to start somewhere, and that would be with the one-shot Poker Under Arms in 1980, of which he got runner-up for the 20th Tezuka Award for. Next up, he would publish another Western one-shot with Outlaw Man in 1981, and Say Hello to Virginia, a sci-fi one-shot, both in special issues of Weekly Shonen Jump. Araki is interesting in that these works are from genres and use ideas which weren't very popular at the time, taking influence from a lot of Western art and media. His art style also feels a lot older too, which he'd clean up a bit before Baoh would begin. You can read all 3 of these one-shots too, as well as his next one-shot and series, Coolshock BT or Demon Boy BT. It originally debuted as a one-shot in Fresh Jump, and then had a 10-chapter run in Weekly Shonen Jump in 1983, but even when pitching the idea, the concept and name were heavily pushed back on by editorial, and it didn't meet any success. It followed a boy named BT who'd beat others with trickery, and you can see a lot of elements from it later crop up in JoJo. Perhaps one day I'll make an Axe File covering it too. But in the next year, Araki would try something a bit different, with more of a battle focused, which would become Baoh. Baoh begins on a black unmarked train, inside of which is a little girl called Sumire, who has a special power revolving around precognition. An evil organization is holding her as cargo, and in her attempt to escape, she comes across one Ikuro Hashizawa, a 17-year-old boy who has been confined to a water tank. His captors call him Baoh though, and I will use both Baoh and Ikuro interchangeably, so I hope that isn't confusing. With all the ruckus, Sumire then causes Baoh to escape, and he turns on his captors, fleeing the train with Sumire. From this point on, Baoh follows the two as they flee from the organization known as Duress, who have sent superpowered assassins to kill them both. Predominantly Ikuro, as he is the seedbed for a parasitic life form known as Baoh, and should it be allowed to grow inside him, he will only grow in strength, and eventually the parasites will spread. This gives us a really interesting setup where there's clearly a group of bad guys, but Ikuro or Baoh itself isn't a strictly good entity. There is a violent parasite within him that does need to die. As Ikuro and Sumire flee via stolen bike, they eventually reach a gas station, but the first assassin sent after them catches up and attempts to kill Ikuro with a knife. This is where Baoh's first armed phenomenon occurs, and he dissolves the killer with acidic-like palms, giving way to a core trait of this manga, body horror, something that would show up a ton later on in JoJo, but Araki really made his debut with it here. This is further pushed by some of the scenes involving Duress, where we see a Baoh parasite which has infected a dog, and they make it fight a tiger, which rips it to shreds. We also get snippets of info of the general goings-on of the organization and the background of the parasite in these sections, and they serve as a nice way to break up scenes. We then return to our main characters, who are hiding out in an abandoned building. Here Ikuro feels there's something wrong inside of him and worries about his current state of being. His thoughts about Sumire too are something I find genuinely touching, as often he wants to protect her from the assassins hunting them down, as well as himself. He's in a real tough situation, and he's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't, and there's a level of helplessness that surrounds him which would be pretty suffocating if it wasn't for Sumire's more chirpy attitude, as well as the occasional appearances of Nozo, this cute little squirrel-like creature, who also joined them from the train. Baoh rarely has time for light-hearted fun though, as the two are caught off guard by armed assassins who gun the two down, but this triggers a transformation in Baoh, turning him into a killing machine, growing bladed arms capable of tearing people's heads off with ease, which he does so as he attacks this group. This is then followed up by Baoh's next adversary, Martin, a genetically modified monkey who at one point eats a mother and child alive, which is kind of fucked up for Jump standards. Araki is really not playing around with Baoh. This fight is a lot more brutal, with Ikuro even losing a leg at one point, and it's cool to see him fight a non-human enemy. It also showcases a few other powers the Baoh parasite possesses. The tactile sensor is one, which allows him to sense emotions and intents. His healing factor is another that allows him to regrow that leg, and his shooting Steebinger, and his final one is his shooting Steebinger phenomenon, and his final one is his shooting Bee Stinger phenomenon, where his hair hardens and he can fire it out, which also spontaneously combusts when it makes contact with skin. It's a pretty odd ability, but it does go to show that Araki was coming up with all sorts of weird ones even before JoJo was made and before stands even existed. After this battle, we get a brief glimpse into Ikuro's backstory, showing Duress are responsible for effectively killing his parents after a car crash, as well as experimenting on him. And then our main duo meet this old couple who live in the woods. The older man is pretty brash and outspoken, even pointing a gun at them, but they are hospitable to our main characters and feed them. All goes awry again though, as the next Duress goon appears before long and hypnotizes the old man. This makes for a pretty interesting encounter, as Baoh can't sense the killing intent from the old man, leading it to be this tense confrontation within the house, where under hypnosis the kind old man is trying to kill everyone and Baoh can't fight back because he doesn't want to kill him. Eventually the old man gets snapped out of his confusion and helps Ikuro fight the assassin. Overall, it's a neat little arc, and I really love the type of character the old man is. Abrasive, you think he's going to be a problem, but actually he's really accepting and kind deep within. He treats Ikuro and Sumire like they're normal kids, which must have been very refreshing for them, and it gives Baoh a little bit of sweetness and relief from its otherwise consistently dark plot. Unfortunately though, Sumire is kidnapped by this assassin who aims to take her back to Duress's headquarters to lure Baoh back there as well, leading Ikuro to chase him down to save her. The final stretch of Baoh sees him traveling to Duress. He saves a girl who's caught in a train track and then engages in a battle with a long-range sniper. This serves to show that Ikuro can utilize his Baoh abilities without transforming, and again it shows that Araki is attempting to write different kinds of fights, which utilize his character's abilities more, as well as the settings he's populated the story with. Something we'd see a lot more when we reach JoJo. Here we're also introduced to Walken, our final antagonist and the best psychic on Earth, as well as the final surviving member of a tribe of American natives. Very unique in concept and design. I really like him, I think he's pretty cool. I also like that Araki may have subverted your expectations of making the greatest psychic character a more battle-hungry, large, muscular character instead of a more brainy one. We then see Ikuro infiltrate Duress's base, fighting off a few fodder enemies and a spider, and utilizing his newly acquired Dark Thunder ability to his fullest. Eventually then he comes face to face with Walken, and the battle between the parasitic human and the best psychic in the world begins. This fight has a lot of narration from the Doctor character, which feels quite reminiscent of later JoJo fights. Think of Speedwagon chiming in, mixed with the way stand users might explain their stand.
What in the blue hell? That crazy blight is inside our horse!
There's a strong back and forth here, and some nice tactical considerations, where Walken entraps Baoh's hand in the wall, but Baoh opts to cut it off to stage a counterattack which takes out Walken. He then rushes to save Sumire, but she gets injured in the process, giving way to Baoh howling with grief. There's a few pages without dialogue here of Ikuro/Baoh realizing the situation, and I think it's really well done. Araki lets this scene breathe, and I'm a big fan of how it's all paneled. Ikuro really feels like he's in pain here. He has recognized Sumire has potentially died and is devastated by it. With Baoh isolated and mourning Sumire, Duress decides to shut him in the room and blow up the base to take him out once and for all. While this is happening though, Ikuro decides on a whim to feed Sumire some of his blood in hopes the healing factor of Baoh passes on, and we get a monologue from him which I really like. Despite how basic the premise might be, the mental battle Ikuro goes through as he's being taken over by the Baoh parasite is pretty interesting. He's always thinking about how he's being consumed, and all the while not really worrying about himself, but the life of Sumire. He's a really selfless individual and a tragic one, not unlike Jonathan Joestar, just a lot quieter and more understated, and this little monologue near the end gives him a nice hint of characterization. We have one last climax though, as Walken returns, adamant to take out Baoh, splitting the ground and throwing Ikuro and the newly awakened Sumire into the caves below the facility. Ikuro urges Sumire to then run deeper into the cave to escape, while he finishes off Walken and kills the doctor for good measure, but by the time he's done, the self-destruct sequence has enough time to finish and everything explodes in 80s action film fashion. We then get a bit of an epilogue and it's bittersweet. Sumire is safe and living with the old couple from before, and with her psychic powers, she sees Ikuro sleeping at the bottom of the underground caves, mirroring the beginning of the story with Ikuro slumbering in water. But she knows that one day she'll see Ikuro again, so she decides to live on happily, waiting until that day arrives. While I personally love Baoh and I think it works as a short story, the fact stands that this is an axe file, so let's theorize why it might have been axed. This will be particularly interesting too, since unlike most other axe files, we're covering a manga from 1984. The magazine was in a completely different state back then, but thankfully you all are dealing with a Jump historian and I can tell you exactly what was in the magazine at the time. Namely, the newest manga post Baoh's release was Dragon Ball. It's easy to see why this rookie in particular would take precedent over Baoh, because Dragon Ball was big even upon release, having been a follow-up from Toriyama's Dr.Slump, which was very beloved at the time. The magazine was also in the early stages of its golden age at this time, and was filled with classic manga, many near the start of their runs, like Fist of the North Star, Kimagure Orange Road, and Ginga Negariboshi Gin. This period also had some classic older manga too, like Kinnikuman and Captain Tsubasa still present, so room overall was pretty tight. What's more, 2 issues after Baoh would end, City Hunter would begin. I hope this helps illustrate that Jump were making big moves during this period, and they were only after the best of the best in terms of manga, and Baoh was a little too weird and seeped in Western sensibility for this, I think. Fist of the North Star had a lot of violence and gore that Baoh was also putting out, and Black Angels had that as well too, as well as a more horror-ish angle, so that niche was already being filled, and the magazine was veering into a cleaner publication debatably, with works like Dragon Ball, City Hunter, and Saint Seiya being a lot more friendlier despite the violence they possessed. Unlike with JoJo, I think the friendship, effort, and victory moniker Jump pushed with its manga wasn't quite there in Baoh, and thus it wasn't the best fit, leading to a cancellation. What does everyone else think of Baoh though? I asked my Discord for some thoughts and got some pretty in-depth responses. First off, we have Jess Anime's first impression, which I find funny, since they call it a bit dated and mention it having an older charm. A manga from 1984 will be like that, though I get it, especially if you compare it to something like Dragon Ball, which debuted weeks later, which feels a lot newer by comparison. It hasn't quite stood the test of time as well, though it certainly has an older charm to it, which I love. They also watched the OVA and praised its art style, though mentioned it enhanced how generic the plot felt for them. And said they had seen the OVA adaptation and say it's decent, but the characters are rather flat. They also think that if it was released today, it would be decently popular due to its darker approach, and I think that could be the case. I do think people would enjoy it, and having this retro horror action feel might feel fresh in today's manga world. I'd also like to see Araki try Baoh again with more modern sensibilities. Harley the Apothecary left a few comments, having some issues with the narration and speech bubbles, which do feel a bit clunky, and possibly it's due to translation or typesetting from one of its 2 translations being a bit off. Despite this, they praised the fights for being energetic and fun, which is definitely one of Baoh's strong suits, and they brought up liking the old man character too. I really like the comparisons made to the Santana arc of part 2 of JoJo, since I mentioned recently in my History of Jump video that this portion feels influenced by older sci-fi movies like Alien, and I totally see these influences in Baoh too. They also bring up it not feeling axed, and I think that's due to Araki wrapping it up really nicely, making it feel just like a good short story. which Sarah had some problems with stakes, with Baoh being near unkillable, so it was hard to take the story seriously for them, and I can totally get that. It said Bao's main weakness is fire, but that never really is utilized enough, and they question the general mechanics of Baoh, with there being plot holes with the parasite itself. While I don't think Baoh has the best internal logic and mostly follows the rule of cool, it does make sense to me at least, enough where I can enjoy it, but I can see people not vibing with it as much if you want something that has tighter construction. Fullmetal comes in with a mixed but overall positive reception. They like the action and horror elements and the two main characters traveling together, which is probably my favorite aspect too. They do cite that it's a bit hard to care about it all due to how short it is, which I can totally get as well. And I 100% agree that it's nice to go back to an author's earlier work who you admire. Seeing their art and storytelling abilities, origin points is cool, and it gives you a bigger appreciation for them overall. Andrew stopped by, who has read Baoh 3 times, and they make some comparisons to Undead Unluck through a friend's experience. The idea of wanting to see an artist develop through their work is an interesting one, and I think I get it. Araki and Tezuka are very individualist authors who really break the mold, so I get why there's a comparison between them. Baoh is totally rich with ideas and approaches Araki would use later too, and I think describing it as a rich space to explore from a creative developmental perspective is a great way to explain part of why I love Baoh so much. It feels like a mini Araki sandbox, so if you're a fan of his work, I'm sure you'll get a lot out of it. And finally we have Porsche. They praise the character designs, which is something I'm all for. Baoh has a proto-JoJo style I really love, and all the designs pop a lot for me. They're simpler and use more basic shapes, and I think it being slightly more stylized contrasts with the gore and horror aspects really well. The way Porsche describes Ikaru's Baoh having a gentle fear to it is very captivating too. There's a grace and beauty to our Baoh as he flits through the battlefield. There's still a glimmer of humanity there, as opposed to the dog and the other monstrous beings that Ikaru faces, and perhaps that shows Ikaru's tenacity and humanity shining through. After all, Araki as an artist heavily features the idea of humanity as a main theme in his works, and Baoh is essentially the story of a boy trying to hold on to that humanity, which sounds strikingly familiar to the events of Phantom Blood, Dio being in a similar position where his humanity is put into question and ultimately he gives in. Porsche does cite Baoh's rapidly growing arsenal of armed phenomenon as a detractor though. They can be a bit contrived and do make the manga feel a bit janky, even though I do like them a lot. Mixed in with this is praise towards Araki of thinking about non-linear battles, and we see this with the sniper fight with Martin and the hypnotized old man. These are less typical battles in a time where Jump was mostly filled with things like Fist of the North Star and Dragon Ball. They for sure weren't perfect, but it's very cool to see that the creator of all the insane JoJo stands started thinking outside the realms of typical battles this early. I'm really happy with the Discord responses this time. I think people brought up some really good criticism as well as conversations surrounding Baoh and Araki as an artist. I also just love that people were willing to engage with an older manga since we usually cover newer releases. Sometimes it's good to take a step back, and I think it really helps to inform your critical and creative understanding of manga and art in general. Before we wrap up for today, I wanted to do a little section on Baoh's OVA, which is pretty rare for an Axe manga to have an adaptation of any sort, especially one that didn't really make any waves upon its release. Baoh the Visitor would see a release in September of 1989, around 5 years after the manga's release, and at a time where Stardust Crusaders was in its early arcs, but due to production cycles, this OVA might have been greenlit or been in production prior to the part even beginning. JoJo is known as a pretty popular and successful series now, but I don't think it was nearly as big during Part 2's release, which makes the adaptation of Baoh quite surprising to me. I think a few factors played into it though. Firstly, the anime industry and the economic state of Japan at the time. 1989, from my understanding, was right in the middle of the Japanese asset price bubble, the bubble era. Fans of Yakuza 0 will know exactly what this is, but essentially it was a period of excessive spending and wealth. Couple this with the creative boom that was going on in the anime industry at the time, where shorter OVAs were becoming increasingly popular, not having to adhere to primetime TV slots and their guidelines, which allowed them to be much more brutal, showing more sex and taboo material, and in general, a lot of violence. These days, I think this period, or at least the 80s and 90s for anime, is known for hyper-violent OVAs. Think Violence Jack, Geno Cyber, Wicked City, Angel Cop, etc. Baoh, I think, fits in with these quite well, albeit being a tad less extreme. Baoh is characterized by its horror action theming, its gore, and with its short length, it would be easy to turn into a short OVA. So at least my theory as to why it exists is Japan and the anime industry just so happened to meet the right conditions for something like Baoh to be adapted, and I'm sure the rising popularity of JoJo helped too. The OVA itself is something you can find readily available online, like on YouTube. It's less than an hour long and it cuts out the middle chunk of the manga, but it's still coherent and very enjoyable as a story. It's well animated, has a great aesthetic overall, and it takes Araki's art style and mixes it with a gritty, more mature 90s OVA vibe. The blood effects are great, they're very saturated, and it's like red jam is exploding everywhere, keeping it gory but not in a disgusting way. It also makes a few changes here and there, like introducing some characters earlier, moving around events, and keeping the lady from the beginning present throughout the story to keep it more consistent and smooth. If you've read the manga, I'd highly recommend watching it, and also if you have no desire to really read the manga, I'd also recommend the OVA since it's pretty short and fun. It's a good one to put on with some friends, perhaps sometime in October even. It'd make for a nice addition to any spooky movie marathon. While Baoh didn't last long due to Jump being filled with extremely popular manga at the time, Araki wouldn't stop and would strive to get his manga into Jump. It would take a few years, but the very first issue of 1987 would see the debut of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure in the magazine, a manga that is still ongoing to this day, with its 9th part, the JoJo Lands, currently being serialized in Ultra Jump. In between all of this, Araki has done numerous one-shots, like the Thus Spoke Kishibe Rohan series, had his artwork featured in the Louvre, collabed with fashion brands like Gucci, and is known as an artist of the highest caliber. This is the first time an Axe manga we've covered has ever been adapted or recognized out of its source due to Araki's popularity, as Baoh has popped up in the game JoJo All-Star Battle and its remake as a playable character, as well as in the OVA I just mentioned. And that was Baoh, Araki's second shot in Jump, and while he had improved since Coolshock BT, it wasn't up to snuff with the other series of Jump's golden age. Thankfully, it has been recognized since then and been shown some love through other media, and overall, I just think it's a neat short sci-fi story. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe and check out the other Axe files here on the channel. There's a ton of them on various Axe manga, which I'm sure you'd enjoy. But chances are, if you watched until here, you'd enjoy my History of Shonen Jump series, where I've tackled Baoh before, as well as Araki's other works and developments. I'll also be gradually tackling each part of JoJo as they come about, since I'm making videos on Shonen Jump year by year. And if you really like what I make, please consider supporting me on Patreon. It helps a ton and you can help influence the direction of the channel a bit. Alongside this, you can get some other perks like voting in exclusive Axe File polls and listening to the exclusive Trent Talks podcast. And at the $3 tier, you'll get thanked at the end of my videos with your own personal little doodle like Kinocha, Jade, Kazuku Gairu, Sorocool Zero, Holly the Apothecary, Mayu, It's Fako, Yellowtail, Lay Sloggett, Chris P. Bacon, Cho Henshin, Full Metal, Unquestionable, and also AB, Vako Draws, and Otaku Gamer X at the $1 tier. Thank you all so much for being patrons, and as always, thank you so much for watching. Remember to be kind and take care.